Okay, we're back, and it's time to hear what's on your mind and what kind of questions you've asked. And I have a whole lot of questions. Can't possibly get through them all, and these are I pulled out the ones that I don't know anything about. So you're not all your questions are going to be asked. I've tried to look at the ones that reflect similar themes, and I'll get to those when I can. But meanwhile, we're going to start with a question from somebody right here in our studio audience. Sarah, are you ready?
Yeah, this really refers back to the mini case, all wind up, no pitch.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, as an employee or a middle level manager, if I really have some ornery upper management, how do I really recruit that champion? Do I just bombard them with data and try to, over time, or how do I really get them interested in the 7-step method, for example?
You may not be able to, not in the short run. There are a couple questions that are similar to yours in the stack that I remember. So let me try to combine an answer that's more than just your question, and we'll hit some of the points raised by other people. There's something that I refer to as an onion patch strategy. Back in the 50s, there was a song called "I'm a Lonely Little Petunia in an Onion Patch." And what do you do if you're a lonely little quality petunia in an old-fashioned management onion patch, and you want to do something, but you don't have much support, and that may or may not have been the situation with the all wind up, no pitch team. And there are a couple general rules of thumb to follow. Is it okay to make improvements and use the 7 steps and so forth when there is no management support? I think you ought to go ahead and do that, in spite of what I said before, that you need management support. And I believe that in the long run, without the leadership and commitment and deep understanding of the leaders of the company, the executive leadership of the company, and various layers of management on down, it's not going to last. Any improvements you make will be short-lived, and maybe the most you'll accomplish without that is not so much anything for your company, but you'll learn a lot yourself about how to make improvements in the people around you. But meanwhile, what do you do if you're stuck in the onion patch? Well, find an area over which you do have some influence and some people who are willing to work with you, and find improvements that you can make within that area, and use the 7 steps and all the things we talked about and all the other things that there are to learn about this business. Use it to make improvements in that area. I would recommend, as just sort of a strategic consideration, try to make improvements that impress not your boss so much as your boss's boss. Ultimately, you have 2 goals in mind. You want to make improvements in whatever area you're making improvements. You want to please the customers, but also you want to let people in the organization know that this stuff works. It works here, and it's important, and it's worth all of us learning it to begin applying it. I have seen companies turn around when managers observed a presentation of an improvement project by some project team. The managers before that were skeptical, but there's something that happens occasionally when a group of people get up and say, here's what we found out. Here were the problems that we started out with. We gathered this data. We found out this about the problems. Here's the changes we introduced as a result of our investigation. Here's the results that we got from it. And you can do a presentation on most projects like that in a half hour or so, just skimming the highlights. And it's a very powerful lesson for the managers. And most managers in situations like will say, that's great. They're not only impressed with the improvement itself, but they're impressed that employees, and sometimes fairly low-rank employees in the organization, are able to engage in those kinds of studies and improvements and find out that much and make those kinds of improvements. My favorite story in that regard had to do with, I'm not sure which company it is. It's in Franklin Park, Illinois, and it's a Japanese management company, and were having a problem with damaged cartons, as I recall, and it was a problem that plagued them forever. And they got a team of people together who, once and for all, licked this carton damage problem. And when they made the presentation, this Japanese-owned company, had to have translators there, not to translate from English to Japanese, because these Japanese managers, all spoke English. They had to have translators there to translate the presentation from Spanish into English, because the people on this project team were all Puerto Rican and Mexican workers who had been taught how to use these tools. And it was very impressive for everybody in the organization to see union members and blue-collar types and folks who may not have had much more than a high school education able to learn these techniques and tools and apply them and make real improvements. It was very impressive. And And the point is, I have seen everybody, in fact, my impression is that it's tough to get managers to learn to apply these tools, sometimes tougher than folks in the trenches. The folks in the trenches know the problems they're having and how to apply them. But let me get back to the onion patch strategy. You want to make improvements that are good for the customers, make real improvements, and learn how to make presentations so that you can educate the managers. You want to try to gradually convince them that these things work. And then you have to be ready to switch gears, because if you're successful and convince managers that these things work here, then they're probably going to look for you to do the teaching of other people and begin promoting it in the organization. Do you want to ask anything more? Is there more to your question?
No, that's great. Thank
okay.
you.
Let me take a couple questions from the crowd. There are a couple of questions. Georgia Tech University, a question on what would be the column headings on the QC process chart for a construction company? All of the column headings would be the same. Column headings would not be different, but what in a construction company, as well as any kind of complicated operation, you have to pick a very defined, specific part of the operation that you describe in the flow chart, and then you have to describe what it is you monitor to make sure that that process is working well, and what do you do with the data that you monitor. So that the type of industry does not affect the QC process chart or its headings, but you do have to understand the logic and understand that what you're trying to describe is how a job gets done, how it gets monitored, and what adjustments need to be made. I want to make another comment that may not necessarily reflect what's on the mind of a person from Georgia Tech U who asked this question, but it has to do with the early stages of learning these things. There's a sort of it's a denial stage that takes place when people are exposed to these lessons. I compare them to the stages of death. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did a study of people who had near-death experiences or were faced with some kind of terminal illness, and they all went through fairly similar stages of death, and in fact, the research has been duplicated, and they are predictable. And the first stage of death is denial, to deny that this is really happening to me. Even, in fact, in automobile accidents where the stages are very instantaneous, very quick ones, the first reaction was, I'm not really having an accident, this is really going to hurt me, or something like that. When people are diagnosed with a terminal disease, they look at the x-rays and say, you got the x-rays mixed up. That's not me. And the same thing happens when companies are faced with the need to apply these quality practices. The first stage of death is denial. And one form of denial is to say, it won't work in our industry. It won't work in this kind of business. It's meant more for engineers than for us, or it's meant more for manufacturing than for service. And all of those I have determined in my own mind are various forms of denial. There are various forms of saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to change. And so I would urge you to do these things and to find out how they work for you. They will work for you, though you may not find an example of exactly your industry or exactly your kind of company, but the logic of it and the use of data will work for your particular company. Somebody from Norman, Oklahoma wants to see an example of a worked out flow chart, and that would be difficult for me to do without some kind of a flip chart or something here, but if you look at the flow chart on the spare parts system, that's an example of a worked out flow chart. And there are a number of examples in a variety of literature. Somebody else had asked, is there more information on some of these tools? For instance, the QC process chart. Where can you learn more about a QC process chart? I only know of one other publication in this country that's in English that even talks about a QC process chart, and there's only 2 pages on it. It's a book by Bob King of Goal called Better Designs in Half the Time. Better Designs in Half the Time is the title of the book. The author is Bob King, and it's published by Goal, whose headquarters are in Methuen, Massachusetts. He has in that book 2 pages, an example of a QC process chart with a whole lot more columns across the top than the example that I gave you. The other examples of QC process charts that I've seen have all been from the Japanese and in Japanese and have required a translator. I think eventually you'll be seeing more and more about them. But don't let that stop you. Just do the best you can. The best way to learn how to do a QC process chart is to do a QC process chart. and then take a look at it critically and show it to other people. Excuse me. How does any of what we have seen before us change when dealing with service and nonprofit organizations? Less than you think. I've struggled a lot with what's the difference between making improvements in manufacturing and making improvements in administrative or service processes. And I keep thinking there aren't that many differences. For one thing, in manufacturing, most of the work is still administrative. I mean, even in a plant, there's a lot of paperwork that has to go on. Even among the folks that are down on the machinery and the equipment, they end up doing a lot of paperwork too. But I guess one difference is that a machine is governed by the laws of science more than an administrative process. There's no chemistry or electrical engineering principles or physics or biology that says what's the best way to enter an order or to send a bill. There are such laws of nature that say what's the best way to make cheese or to make paper or to develop a machine or something like that. So that the blueprints are there, the scientific process is there that provides a parameter for what you can do. In administrative processes, often there is no best way to take an order. There is no best way to send an invoice. What's important is that everybody does it the same way, and therefore, because there is no obvious, based on science, best way, and people end up with their own opinions, which are often equally valid opinions, but you have to come to agreement on what's the standardized process. So that the process of improvement, the process of standardization, is more a political process, getting people who disagree and who have equally good reasons for their opinion to agree on one. And therefore, the standardization process is the hardest step, getting people to agree on one single method, and then to start taking data and then find ways to improve it. But the 7 steps are equally applicable to an administrative process. You just define different gaps than you might in a manufacturing process, and you find different causes. I guess one other possible difference is when you're seeking the cause. What's the cause of somebody not entering all the information on a form? That's different than the cause of why this particular warp is taking place in the product, in the process of production. The cause of administrative errors, how do you test to see what the cause is? Sometimes you can't find out what the cause is unless you develop some kind of hypothesis on what the cause is and create a new method aimed at avoiding that hypothetical cause. And then if you use this new method for a certain period of time and the problem doesn't appear, then you can say, we think we've got it licked. There's sometimes not as direct a connection between the effect and the cause in administrative processes. But by and large, the logic is the same and the need for data is the same. And there's an amazing amount of data that you can get on administrative processes. We in this country are not lacking for data. What we are lacking is good data. We have all sorts of junk data. We have numbers up the kazoo. We just don't have anything that tells us how to improve. Could you please give me an example of a Pareto chart? Without being able to draw it out for you, it's difficult. But if you've ever seen a bar chart, a histogram or a bar chart, it'll identify on the vertical axis there will be numbers, increments of amounts. And the lower on the chart it is, the fewer there are, the higher on the number on the chart it is, the more there are. It could be accidents, for instance, the number of accidents. And then there will be bars corresponding to different types of accidents, just to use that example. So some bars will be higher because there are more of that kind of accidents. Other bars will be lower because there are fewer of that kind of accidents. Pareto chart is a bar chart, but the bars are organized in sequence from left to right, so that the biggest bar is first on the left part of the chart, and then the second biggest, and the third biggest, and the fourth biggest, and the fifth biggest. Well, what's the advantage of that? The advantage of that is that it helps visually to show where you should probably begin working. Because the general principle, the Pareto principle, is that you want a few factors contribute to most of the problem. So you want to get those few factors that create most of the problems and therefore you want to start where the greatest gain is. Let's say you have one kind of accident that accounts for 60% of all of the accidents that you have. Well, if you work on that accident, you're going to get a whole lot of gain. If you cut that in half, you will make greater gain than if you take the smaller bar in the chart where you've only got 5% of the accidents and cut that one in half. It's a fairly obvious principle. The advantage of the chart itself is that it shows graphically which is your biggest hitter. Here's a tough question from Portland, Oregon. What's the functional relationship between innovation and improvement? And is there a 7-step method for innovation as opposed to improvement? It's clear to me some things are simply improving. You take the system that you got and you improve it, and you use the 7-step method to do that. It's also clear to me that sometimes you've got a brand new system, new equipment, new machinery, a whole new process that's not in any way resembling the old system, and that's innovation. But often there's a gray area in between, or you're keeping a lot of the old system, but you're changing a new way of doing this or a new way of doing that. So it's an innovation that's a kind of localized innovation on a larger system. And so sometimes it almost doesn't matter. Although the difference is that by and large, when you're introducing something new and you know what it is you're introducing, you use a PDCA cycle. When you're trying to solve a problem on the existing system and you don't know what the problem is yet, therefore you don't know what the solution is, you use the 7-step method. But I acknowledge that there's a gray area and it's difficult to describe whether you're dealing with one or the other. I guess when in doubt, I would do a lot of the 7-step thinking first. It's related to another question that's not right in front of me, but I remember the card distinctly, and it's a legitimate issue. I have the one diagram, as you recall, that showed the difference between using the PDCA cycle and 7-step method, and when you go to one or the other and ask the question, is the solution known? If yes, is it simple? If yes, go do it. And the question on the card, as I recall, was, what do you do about managers who think that they know the solution when in fact they probably don't, or when they think the solution is simple when in fact it isn't? And again, that's not a logic and data problem, that's an illogic and dataless problem. It's a political issue, and it's a larger issue. I would treat that as something that you can't deal with in terms of this specific improvement or need or problem that has to be solved. Managers, and this is a long, slow period of education and exposure, and probably a lot of onion patch stuff. Managers need to understand the slower, more systematic, logical, data-based approach to problem solving, and that's a constant struggle. We have a desire in this country for what Dr. Deming calls instant pudding. We want the quick fixes, and that's what's led us down the tubes before, and will continue to do that. I think what I have encouraged people to do from time to time is to take a specific project, a specific problem in the company, some need for improvement, and get the permission of management to do an experiment. That is, we know that this is not the way we usually approach problem solving, but we want to try this. And if you get them to agree to do it in this way, at least for this application, that allows you to show how it works and why it works, and maybe to show that it'll work better than the method that's been used before. But the early stages of adapting the quality methods to each company are difficult. And a lot of the questions that are in the pile are, what do you do with a bunch of people who don't want to do it? How do you overcome resistance to change? How do you deal with the larger issues? In fact, some of the questions I've decided not to take on today are those that are beyond the scope of this particular workshop. This particular workshop is probably aimed at folks who have been working at this for a while and want to learn more tools and advance their knowledge. But how do you start? What do you do in the first week or the first month or the first year? Those are tough questions, and we have developed some strategies for doing that, but it starts at the top of the organization with a lot of education, a lot of patient work with the managers. Meanwhile, they're doing things the old way all over the company, but we're slowly getting them ready for a gradual transformation. I think we have a question from the audience, and this gentleman in the front row. Jim, do you have a question?
Yeah, Peter, getting back to the instant pudding and what managers want a lot, you have an area that needs a lot of improvement. But you know from experience looking at the step one about the importance of really getting a nice small bite there for a project to work on. Do you have any other guidelines to offer around how small a bite are you talking about? And especially when you consider the managers want a lot done quickly.
Yeah, and there was a similar question in there. How do you reconcile the importance of a systems view with the idea of taking a small bite? Let me answer the second question first, and then I'll get to yours. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer a question in the pile. You have to work on this bite, but then when you think you know what you have to do with this small bite, then back away from that and say, before we go ahead very much further, let's look at the whole system. Kepner-Trago has a part of what they teach is called a potential problem analysis, and that's what you say. Before we go ahead and implement this improvement, let's say, what are the repercussions that we're liable to feel throughout the organization, and what do we manage, or what do we monitor, rather, to make sure that we're not having side effects in the rest of the system that we don't want to have, unintended side effects. And now to get to your question, how big a bite to take, and that's, boy, it's sure hard to come up with a particular guideline. If you're new at this, I would say start out believing that you're probably taking too big a bite. And so let me describe to you the difference, for instance, between what I consider a system and a process. A system is a network of processes. Running a pizzeria is a system. It consists of a variety of processes for doing this or that or another thing. Making pizza dough is a process. You can describe it in a sequence of steps that are relatively contained. Once you've finished making the pizza dough, then it's ready for the next stage of the process. So if you don't know what you've got, I guess what I do is say, divide up the work in 5 or 6 basic steps. And then look at each of those and divide that up into 5 or 6 basic sub-steps. And maybe, if necessary, take each of those sub-steps and divide those up into 5 or 6 basic sub-steps. And then begin to see if you've gone about as far as you can go in dividing them up, and then maybe you're down to a process. Maybe you're down to making pizza dough. And that's what you ought to work on. Now, how do you know which of those things to work on? If the whole process is in trouble, how do you know which of those bites is the one to take? Well, that's part of the work in the step one of the 7-step process. If you don't know where it's happening, but you know that somewhere in this big mess we're having some pain, we're having some problems, then you have to start gathering data before you can even define what the project is. And sometimes you need to use output data to say which of those we're going to take on, and then try to trace back into the system where's the likely sources of those data. It may take a long time. Sometimes when problems are buried deep within the system, it's the devil's own job to track them down and localize them, which is a step 2 step. But that's why I said earlier, steps 1 and 2 of the 7-step process are the ones that take the most time. But if you do them well, the rest will come easy. Is that enough answer to your question?
Yeah. If you tied it back to managers wanting a lot done in a hurry, is there any particular trick to telling them, hey, we need to work on pizza dough right now, we can't work on improving sales?
Yeah, that's one of those kind of early stages of denial type questions. Which step of the 7 steps would you eliminate? And then how in the world are you going to define what it is that needs improving until you've narrowed it down? There's one other question related to that I might as well comment. Somebody said something about what if you're not, can you approach improvement by improving a process and not problem solving? That this has been focused on taking a problem or a gap and solving it. Can you also approach improvement by saying, here's a process that we want to improve? I personally don't think that there's a difference between those two, other than a couple initial questions. That is, if you're solving a problem, eventually you're going to have to get down to the process which produces the problem. So you'll be describing the sequence of steps and where in that sequence of steps something goes wrong. If you start with a process, you're going to be identifying the sequence of steps as the starting point, but you're going to ask questions. What do we want to improve? Do we want to make it go faster? Do we want to reduce the variation? what does improvement mean? And so you're going to be defining a problem, which is the first step of the 7-step process. So I don't see a whole lot of difference between those two, except in the first couple of questions that you ask as you're defining the project. I think we had another question in the audience.
Right. Peter, I frequently interact with groups who are ready to replace wholesale a system that may have some age on it, but is still functioning, even though it does have problems. What types of guidelines do you use when approaching whether you should work on improving an existing system, in particular an operating system, or whether in fact you should look at capital replacement of that system?
Yeah, we are much too quick to jump into capital replacement and to give up on the old processes. And that's an example of what I talked about before, the illusion of improvement. We jump to innovation and then watch that deteriorate because we don't know how to run that. Guidelines for that. Let me describe as well as I can remember it what I heard is used in Japan as a guideline for that. They'll spend 2 years improving the existing system before they'd sink any capital investment in it. They believe that they can reduce errors or mistakes or defects by half the first year and by another half the second year, and then they think to start making further gains the third year, that it may require some capital investment. I may be misquoting my source on that, but it's roughly that kind of a guideline for going from improvement of the current system to beginning to introduce innovations or capital investment in the current system. And I think it's a pretty good guideline, even if I've misquoted it. I think we need to learn how to improve what we do, and there's a very specific technology. We've talked about a little of it today, but there's many more things we can learn about improving the systems, and it's just too easy to go out and buy a new machine or buy a new bell or whistle to hang on the old machine until we've learned how to use what we've got. There's a great Hewlett-Packard story, and I noticed there's some questions from Hewlett-Packard people about a dipped soldering machine, I think it was, and how they had declared surplus a soldering machine because it was the error rate in the soldering machine was too high. And they bought a new soldering machine, a major capital investment, and then Hewlett-Packard, Yokogawa Hewlett-Packard, their Japanese subsidiary, bought up this surplus machine, the machine that had been declared dead. They bought it up and brought it over to Tokyo, and there's some wonderful statistical graphs on the rate of improvement that they made on this old piece of equipment. And they had, in fact, they had to change the graph from percents to parts per million because the percent decline got so difficult to see in a graph that they wanted to convert it to a scale that would show improvement. Meanwhile, the new machine that the United States Hewlett-Packard plant bought was performing better than the old machine, but not nearly as good as the old machine as it was being run by Yokogawa Hewlett-Packard. It's a dramatic example for me of somebody who knows how to improve as opposed to somebody who only knows how to buy new equipment. The Hewlett-Packard in the United States has since learned a whole lot about improving, so they are better than that story right now. Let me try a couple of questions from the crowd. Here's a question that I won't say much about, but there are a lot of questions like this. What's the best way to implement a total quality program? Hire a full-time quality improvement director, use a consultant, use a working council of employee involvement at a university. Asking a consultant how you should start a quality program is a little bit like asking a barber how you should get your hair cut. I'll try to say this in a way that won't sound self-serving. I think it's very difficult for most organizations to do this without some kind of outsider telling them how to do it. And there are a couple ways of doing that. Consultants are obviously one. The consultants who are good at this are in great demand and are hard to book and are very expensive, and most organizations can't afford them. What's being developed in this country that's, I find, a source of great hope are regional networks. There are probably in the United States 25 or 30 regional networks of people who are trying to learn and trying to apply these methods. I know of one in San Diego area. There's one in the Madison, Wisconsin area. There's one in Milwaukee and Green Bay. just in Wisconsin. The Western Ohio Quality Improvement Network is very active and very busy, and PACE in Philadelphia. And I could go on, and maybe some of my friends who are in networks that I didn't mention today will be upset that I didn't remember to mention them. But there are a great many regional networks that are getting better and better at helping the folks in that area learn how to apply these things and learn it more and more. But if you can get a good consultant, I would recommend that you get one. I'm not sure what a working council of employee involvement at a university, what that refers to. Maybe something local. But let me make a comment about the term worker involvement. At Joyner Associates, we use a triangle to describe what total quality is about. At the top of the triangle is the word quality, because we believe that an absolutely essential part of this whole effort is the quality of the goods and services, the features of the goods and services that we manufacture and deliver to our customers, and also the quality of the processes by which we deliver those things. So it's, you don't get good output without good processes. And that's what quality means, is both of those dimensions. The lower right-hand corner of the triangle is all one team. And it refers to both the culture of teamwork. Deming talks about driving out fear, breaking down barriers, creating a collaborative, trustful system of relationships within a company, because if you don't have that, you can't do the scale of effort in improvement that's necessary. And when people are fearful, they're not going to tell you the truth. And without the truth, you won't know how to make improvements. It refers also to teamwork in a smaller sense, in a microcosm sense, meaning having small groups of people do work that individuals can't do by themselves, and learning the technology of small group work. The book, the Team Handbook, is aimed at that dimension of teamwork. But I think even more important part of teamwork is what I described before, the culture of teamwork within a company. The third, in the lower left-hand corner of the triangle, is scientific approach. It's use of data. It's the use of very specific, logical, data-driven approaches, such as we've talked about today. All three of those corners are necessary. You can't do away with any two of them or any one of them. If you had a consciousness of the customer and quality and teamwork, you're not going to succeed without the data corner. And I have seen teachers of quality talk about the total quality as though it were simply a matter of worker involvement. And it's that phrase in this card that triggered my comments right now. It's not just simply a matter of getting people, workers and employees involved and participating and caring about the customers. They have to use data. They have to use the scientific approach. It's also not enough to have some people use the scientific approach and have a consciousness of customers, in effect using the lower left-hand corner of the triangle and the top of the triangle. You have to have everybody involved. There's too much to do. There's too many ways of making mistakes without having everybody in the company involved in the effort. Similarly, you can't have the two bottom corners of the triangle, a lot of teamwork and a lot of scientific approach, and have it not directly related to customers, customer satisfaction, customer delight, and improvement of the processes by which you deliver your goods and services. So I think all three of those ingredients are important. All three of those ingredients are what Dr. Deming is talking about. It's our way of summarizing, in fact, his 14 points. And so I get nervous when I hear people equating worker involvement with the quality movement. Worker involvement is important, but it's not enough. Edison State Community College also, how do you turn around managers? Old-timers, seat-of-the-pants achievers, short-term promotion goalers, those who have no commitment. Boy, if I had the answer to that, I'd bottle it and make a fortune. First of all, I would object to the first one, the old-timers. I have seen old-timers, and the older I get, the more I object to it. I have seen old-timers, in fact, become the champions of this. I have seen companies where people who had 1 year to go before their retirement found out about this stuff, and they said, by damn, I want to leave a legacy in this company of institutionalizing some of these practices. It's the best thing I can do before I go. I saw one man who was a year and a half away from retirement. He was the head. He was not even the head of a purchasing department. He was just a clerk in the purchasing department who found out about these practices, and he found out about it through participation in a project team. And he said, "This stuff is so important. I'm going to spend this year and a half turning around the purchasing policies of this organization." And he did it to a great extent. He was able to do it because he got fired up by it. So I see as much resistance among new-timers as I see among old-timers. I don't think that's the dividing line. Though it's probably true that some people develop habits and they have to have something happen to shake them out of the old habits. Seat of the pants achievers, especially if they've been good at it, are tough to dislodge. Somebody said to ask managers to agree to do things a different way is a little bit like asking those people who've been dealt 4 aces to change the card game. They've achieved their success through these old methods and been recognized through the old methods. In fact, some companies want their managers to be able to make quick decisions without data. They recognize that as a value to be pursued. And how do you change that? It's one drip at a time. It's just bit by bit by bit by bit. A good place to start is where those methods aren't working. So as a consultant, I try to start where they're feeling pain, and then try to show how these methods will work where the old methods were not working, and in the hopes that we can succeed in solving some of the old problems or some of the problems that defy the old methods, and then start using these methods on other things that they thought they were in control of. It's one of the things I think that's been a barrier in this country to the adaptation of these quality methods is our success. Our success has gotten in the way. Our own success has created the complacence. And it's a legitimate question to ask, will we ever start doing these things without the threat of extinction? The American companies that are doing them, the Harley Davidsons and the Fords, are those companies that are in real trouble. If they don't do them, they won't survive. Harley Davidson is the only motorcycle company that survived. When I visited a few years ago some of the Deming Prize companies in Japan, we asked each of them, what got you started? And it was the threat of extinction. They were about to go under. And that was the motivation that they needed to get started. Since then, I've been encouraged to see that some American companies are using these practices without having their backs to a wall, without having that kind of threat. And that's encouraging because we can't afford to wait until we've gone down for the second time and we're about to go down for the third time. A lot of companies failed because they started to try to recover too late. You mentioned, oh, excuse me, that was a question I already answered. The company that I work for is very progressive and results-oriented. This is from Tampa, Florida. Management often know all the solutions before they know the problems. Could you please reinforce or talk further about the dangers from a management standpoint of knowing what the solution is and assuming that the solution is simple? I'm sorry, I didn't, when I got to the end of the card, I realized I'd answered it already. In determining the root cause, explain when and how you would use each of the methods, 5 whys, cause and effect, an affinity diagram, and how do they interrelate. I said a little bit about cause and effect. I would use that later rather than sooner, after you've narrowed down to a specific localized area, and then use the cause and effect diagram to find out the possible causes of this very specific localized problem. 5 whys, I would use it a lot of times. It helps to narrow down the effort. Sometimes I'd ask 5 whys in step 1 to see if that'll help shake loose some of those things. You know, why are we having delays in delivery? If the problem is delays in delivery, why are we having delays in delivery? We may know some immediate information that'll help us narrow the problem. But by and large, I would probably use the 5 whys in the beginning of the cause step 3, before I use the cause and effect diagram. The affinity diagram refers to a tool that we haven't talked about today. So I'll answer the question for the sake of those of you who know what an affinity diagram is, and those of you who don't know what an affinity diagram are will have to live with the confusion. I would use affinity diagrams in step one. Affinity diagrams are a great way of taking a massive confusion and trying to make sense out of it. It's a way of defining the problem in the first place. So if you want to see what an affinity diagram, a good source for that is a book called Memory Jogger Plus, which is published also by Gold, the same people that published the book that I just mentioned, the Better Designs in Half the Time. But I am quickly running out of time, and the questions that I see before me immediately would take more than the minute and a half that I have left to answer. So let me try to summarize by making a couple comments. This stuff isn't easy, and what you're seeing are tools that are probably most effectively used by people who've been slugging it out in the trenches for a year or a year and a half or two, although I'd be curious to see if some of you who are younger at this than that apply these and find them useful. This whole adaptation of the total quality philosophy and trying to get it within our systems is a difficult task, but it's an absolutely vital task. It's a challenge before this country, it's a challenge before each of your companies within this country and each of your organizations to learn how to do it. And it's too important to use excuses for not doing it. It's too important to use such excuses as, well, there aren't enough examples in service areas, or there are not enough examples in our particular industry or our particular type of organization, or our leadership doesn't want it. I think the urgency is too great. I think our country is in great danger in terms of the competitive market. I think this is the only way that we can survive, frankly, and time is running short, not only for the company and the country, but also for this seminar. I hope to see you again, those of you who I didn't see but who are watching me through the downlink and hearing me through that system. I appreciate your questions and your input. I'm sorry that I didn't have time to get to all the questions, but maybe we'll have another opportunity to do this again. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's telecast. Audio and video tapes of this seminar are available through the Continuing Engineering Education program at the George Washington University. For further information, please call 800-424-9773, or in Canada, 800-535-4567. Good day from Washington, D.C.